The Battle of Narva unfolded amid the complex and brutal closing years of the Second World War, a period marked by shifting fronts and desperate struggles across Eastern Europe. The geopolitical backdrop of this battle was shaped by the larger conflict between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, two powers locked in a deadly contest for control of Eastern Europe and the Baltics. The region of Narva, located in northeastern Estonia near the Gulf of Finland, became a focal point as Soviet forces advanced westward in 1944, aiming to push German troops out of the Baltics and secure access to the Baltic Sea. National interests played a crucial role in shaping the conflict at Narva. For the Soviet Union, reclaiming the Baltics was essential not only for territorial restoration, but also for securing strategic naval bases and lines of communication. The Soviet leadership was determined to crush any remaining German resistance and incorporate these territories firmly into the USSR. On the German side, the Baltics were seen as vital for defensive depth, protecting the heartland of Germany and providing a barrier against Soviet advances. The German military, weakened but still formidable, aimed to hold the Narva region to delay Soviet progress and maintain a foothold on the eastern flank. Alliances and shifting loyalties complicated the conflict. The German forces defending Narva included a significant contingent of Waffen-SS units, many composed of volunteers and conscripts from various nationalities, including Estonians, Finns, and others. These units were integrated into the broader Wehrmacht structure, but retained distinct identities. The presence of local Estonian units fighting alongside German forces reflected the complex political and national dynamics in the region, as many locals viewed the Germans as a bulwark against Soviet occupation. Military preparedness on both sides was uneven, but intense. The Soviet Red Army had grown in strength and experience through successive campaigns, boasting large formations, artillery, and air support. Soviet intelligence estimated the German forces defending Narva as determined but increasingly overstretched. German defenders were entrenched and well supplied despite dwindling resources elsewhere. The terrain around Narva, with forests, rivers, and urban areas, presented challenges and opportunities for both attackers and defenders. Public sentiment in the region was deeply divided. Many Estonians resented Soviet occupation and welcomed German forces as liberators or defenders, though this was far from universal. The civilian population faced hardships from ongoing military operations, occupation policies, and the war's destruction. Propaganda efforts by both sides sought to influence morale and loyalty, often exacerbating tensions. Thus, the stage was set for a fierce and protracted battle at Narva, emblematic of the broader struggle for control over the Baltic states and the Eastern Front's shifting fortunes. The complex interplay of geopolitical ambitions, national identities, and military realities shaped the conflict, making Narva a critical and symbolic battleground in 1944. The opening phase of the Battle of Narva began in February 1944, as Soviet forces launched a major offensive aimed at breaching the German defensive lines and capturing the strategically vital city of Narva and its surrounding region. The Red Army's Leningrad Front, under Marshal Leonid Govorov, sought to break through the German Army Group North, commanded by General Georg von Küchler, who was tasked with holding the Baltic territories against the advancing Soviets. Initial Soviet movements involved concentrated artillery barrages and infantry assaults designed to penetrate the well-fortified German defensive positions along the Narva River. The German forces, composed of Wehrmacht units supplemented by Waffen-SS formations, including the 3rd SS Panzer Corps and the 20th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, 1st Estonian, were prepared for a determined defense. These units utilized the region's natural defensive features, including the river itself, dense forests, and urban strongpoints, to create layered defensive belts. Command structures on both sides reflected the operation's significance. The Soviets coordinated multiple armies within the Leningrad Front, including the Second Shock Army and the Eighth Army, under unified command focused on a rapid breakthrough. On the German side, General Johannes Friesner oversaw Army Group North's defense, with direct control of divisions and SS Corps committed to holding key positions. Waffen-SS units, with their distinctive esprit de corps and combat experience, played a pivotal role in stiffening the German defense. The early days of fighting were marked by intense artillery duels, air engagements, and close-quarters combat. Soviet forces achieved some localized gains, pushing forward in areas where German defenses were thinner, but these advances were often costly and met with rapid German counterattacks. The German defenders skillfully employed flexible defensive tactics, including mobile reserves and counterattacks that disrupted Soviet spearheads and limited territorial losses. Civilian populations in and around Narva experienced the immediate effects of renewed hostilities. The intense shelling and ground combat caused destruction of homes, infrastructure, and disrupted basic services. Many civilians fled the combat zones, seeking refuge in safer areas amid harsh winter conditions. Both Soviet and German propaganda sought to sway local sentiment, portraying their forces as liberators or defenders, deepening the region's complex social and political dynamics. Morale among the German defenders was bolstered by a combination of factors: the presence of motivated Waffen-SS units, a strong defensive posture, and the belief that holding Narva was critical to slowing Soviet advances and protecting the Baltic region. Soviet troops were driven by the overarching goal of reclaiming occupied Soviet territory and ending the prolonged siege conditions in Leningrad. However, they faced the challenges of entrenched opposition, difficult terrain, and fierce resistance. The initial engagements set the tone for a protracted and brutal struggle. Neither side gained decisive advantage in the opening phase, but the Germans successfully blunted Soviet attempts to break their lines. The intensity of combat and the importance attributed to the Narva front made it a focal point of the Eastern Front's shifting balance in early 1944. This opening phase thus laid the groundwork for months of attritional fighting, marked by tactical innovation, determined defense, and the interplay of national and ideological motivations. The strategic goals and meticulous planning behind the Battle of Narva reflected the high stakes faced by both German and Soviet commanders in early 1944. For the German Army Group North, preserving the Narva region was critical to maintaining a defensive buffer protecting the Estonian coastline, the Baltic seaports, and the northern approaches to Germany itself. The Waffen-SS units, particularly the 20th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, 1st Estonian, were charged with defending the region with resolve, motivated by a combination of military discipline, nationalistic fervor, and fear of Soviet reoccupation. The Germans sought to delay Soviet advances for as long as possible, buying time for the construction of defensive lines further west and protecting evacuation routes for troops and civilians. Their doctrine emphasized a flexible defense in depth, combining static fortifications with mobile counterattacks. Logistics efforts focused on maintaining supply lines through difficult winter terrain and damaged infrastructure, essential for sustaining the forces holding the front. On the Soviet side, the Leningrad Front's strategic objective was clear: to break through the German defenses at Narva, secure the Estonian territory, and open the way for further advances into the Baltic states. The Red Army aimed to complete the liberation of Soviet lands, restore access to Baltic ports, and cut off German forces trapped in the Courland pocket. Soviet military planning included massive artillery preparation, combined arms coordination, and the use of overwhelming manpower and equipment. The Soviets amassed significant forces, including infantry divisions, tank brigades, and artillery units, supported by air power. Their doctrine focused on concentrated offensives aimed at breaching defensive lines and exploiting breakthroughs swiftly. Soviet logistics emphasized mass mobilization and supply despite harsh weather and terrain challenges. Propaganda on both sides played an influential role. The Germans portrayed their defense as a heroic stand against Bolshevik aggression, seeking to bolster morale among troops and local populations. Soviet propaganda framed the offensive as a righteous liberation campaign, rallying soldiers and civilians to the cause of defeating fascism. Miscalculations affected both sides. The Germans underestimated the scale and determination of the Soviet buildup, while the Soviets initially underestimated the strength and resilience of Waffen-SS formations and local defenders. These misjudgments would contribute to the protracted and costly nature of the battle. Thus, the strategic planning for the Battle of Narva involved a complex interplay of military objectives, logistical challenges, and ideological motivations. Both sides committed substantial resources and manpower, anticipating a decisive confrontation that would influence control of the Baltic region and the broader Eastern Front. The meticulous preparations set the stage for fierce fighting marked by attrition, tactical innovation, and profound human cost. The initial clashes of the Battle of Narva erupted in late February 1944, marking the commencement of one of the Eastern Front's most arduous and strategically significant engagements. Soviet forces of the Leningrad Front initiated their offensive with concentrated artillery bombardments aimed at weakening German defensive lines along the Narva River. The opening artillery barrages were extensive, designed to disrupt enemy fortifications, destroy supply depots, and reduce the combat effectiveness of German infantry and armor. German forces, consisting predominantly of Waffen-SS units, including the 20th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, 1st Estonian, and supported by Wehrmacht elements, were entrenched in heavily fortified positions. These forces leveraged natural defensive advantages, such as the river's course, dense forests, and urban terrain to establish multiple defensive belts. German command structures, under General Johannes Friesner and General Felix Steiner, coordinated the deployment of infantry, artillery, and armored reserves to respond rapidly to Soviet thrusts. The early phase of combat was characterized by fierce and localized engagements. Soviet infantry attempted to breach the complex German defenses, often encountering fierce resistance from machine gun nests, anti-tank weapons, and well-coordinated counterattacks. Tank and self-propelled gun units played a pivotal role on both sides, engaging in close-quarters armored warfare across narrow front lines and constricted terrain. The Soviets deployed massed infantry and armor formations to exploit any weaknesses, while German units utilized mobile reserves to seal breaches and conduct tactical counterstrikes. Air superiority was contested fiercely. The Soviet VVS, Air Force, sought to disrupt German supply and communication lines and provide close air support to ground operations. The Luftwaffe responded with fighter and ground attack missions aimed at maintaining air dominance and protecting the German front. The air war added a significant dimension to the ground fighting, affecting both tactical engagements and logistical operations. Civilian populations in the Narva region suffered immediate consequences as the battle unfolded. Intense shelling and ground combat devastated urban areas and villages, leading to widespread destruction and displacement. Civilians faced shortages of food, medical care, and shelter amidst the freezing winter conditions. Propaganda efforts by both sides attempted to sway local opinion and maintain morale. Yet, the realities of war imposed severe hardships on non-combatants. Morale among German defenders was buoyed by a combination of factors. Disciplined Waffen-SS troops, renowned for their combat effectiveness, strong leadership, and a defensive mindset focused on protecting their homeland and allies. Soviet soldiers were motivated by the broader strategic imperative of liberating occupied territories and the ideological commitment to defeating fascism. Despite these motivations, the brutal conditions, fierce resistance, and attritional nature of the fighting tested the resolve of all combatants. Unexpected outcomes emerged during these early battles. The Soviets, despite numerical superiority and extensive preparatory fire, were unable to secure rapid breakthroughs. The well-prepared German defenses and adept tactical responses blunted initial Soviet offensives, foreshadowing a protracted struggle. The opening phase thus set a grim tone, emphasizing attrition, tactical complexity, and the interplay of terrain, weather, and force composition that would define the Battle of Narva. As the Battle of Narva progressed into March and April 1944, the conflict escalated significantly, with both Soviet and German forces committing additional troops, armor, and artillery in a brutal contest for control of the strategic region. The Soviet Leningrad front intensified its offensive efforts, seeking to penetrate the German defensive belts and secure a decisive breakthrough that would open the way for liberation of Estonia and advance towards the Baltic coast. German defenders, bolstered by Waffen-SS units such as the 11th SS Volunteer Panzergrenadier Division Nordland and the 20th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS 1st Estonian, responded with fierce resistance. Their defensive doctrine combined static fortifications with dynamic counterattacks, exploiting their intimate knowledge of the terrain and superior defensive preparations. These units demonstrated tactical flexibility, often conducting rapid local counteroffensives to regain lost ground and disrupt Soviet advances. The terrain around Narva, characterized by forests, rivers, and urban areas, played a pivotal role in shaping the fighting. Dense woods and swampy ground restricted large-scale armored maneuvers, forcing both sides to engage in close-quarters combat. The weather, transitioning from winter to spring, introduced additional challenges with muddy conditions hindering troop and vehicle movement. Supply lines on both sides were strained, with damaged infrastructure and partisan activity complicating logistics. Casualties mounted as the intensity of combat increased. Soviet forces, although possessing numerical superiority, faced well-entrenched defenders with effective anti-tank weapons and artillery support. Tank battles, infantry assaults, and artillery duels became daily occurrences, with neither side able to secure decisive gains for extended periods. The Soviet Second Shock Army and Eighth Army, among others, bore the brunt of these assaults, suffering heavy losses amid determined German defense. Command challenges emerged amid the fluid and chaotic battle conditions. Coordination between Soviet infantry, armor, artillery, and air support required constant adjustment, with communication often disrupted by terrain and enemy action. German commanders worked to maintain cohesion among disparate units, integrating local Estonian volunteers with German forces, balancing morale, and managing limited reserves. Political tensions within the German High Command were palpable. Adolf Hitler's insistence on holding the Narva line clashed with some commanders' concerns over the sustainability of the defense, given the mounting pressure and resource constraints. On the Soviet side, Stavka's leadership pushed for rapid advances to capitalize on strategic momentum, but had to contend with operational setbacks and the costs of attrition. Internationally, the battle was closely watched, as the Baltics were considered critical to the overall war effort. The Soviet push through Narva threatened to cut off German forces in the Courland Peninsula, potentially trapping them and shortening the front. Civilian populations continued to endure immense suffering. Prolonged shelling and ground combat destroyed homes and infrastructure, forcing many to flee or endure dire conditions. Food shortages, medical deprivation, and displacement became widespread, exacerbated by the ongoing military conflict. The escalation and crisis phase of the Battle of Narva thus epitomized the brutal, grinding warfare characteristic of the Eastern Front's latter stages. It showcased the tactical skill and determination of German Waffen-SS defenders and the relentless Soviet drive to reclaim occupied territories. This period set the stage for the intense battles that would define the campaign's peak and shape the region's fate. The peak of the Battle of Narva, occurring during the spring and early summer of 1944, was characterized by some of the fiercest and most protracted fighting on the Eastern Front. This phase witnessed intense combat as German Waffen-SS units, reinforced by Wehrmacht formations and local Estonian volunteers, mounted a determined defense to hold the critical Narva line against overwhelming Soviet offensives. The German defense relied on a combination of well-prepared static fortifications, trenches, minefields, anti-tank ditches, and mobile reserves capable of launching counterattacks to regain lost positions. Waffen-SS formations, notably the 11th SS Volunteer Panzer Grenadier Division, Nordland, and the 20th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, 1st Estonian, played pivotal roles, leveraging their combat experience and local knowledge to stiffen resistance. These units demonstrated a high degree of cohesion and tactical flexibility, often engaging in close-quarters combat under challenging conditions. Soviet forces, particularly the 2nd Shock Army and 8th Army, conducted repeated offensives aimed at breaking through the German lines to capture Narva and push westward. Massive artillery bombardments preceded infantry and armor assaults, seeking to wear down defenders and exploit any breakthroughs. Despite the Red Army's numerical superiority and growing operational experience, the German defenses absorbed the attacks with remarkable resilience, inflicting heavy casualties. The terrain around Narva complicated operations for both sides. Dense forests, marshlands, and the Narva River itself presented formidable natural obstacles that restricted maneuverability and favored defensive operations. Urban areas, such as the city of Narva and its outskirts, became scenes of brutal street fighting, with soldiers engaged in fierce close combat amid rubble and ruins. High command decisions during this peak phase were critical. German commanders balanced the need to hold strategic positions with the realities of dwindling manpower and materiel. Hitler's directives emphasized no retreat, compelling commanders to commit reserves and fight tenaciously despite adverse conditions. Soviet leadership focused on maintaining relentless pressure, rotating units to sustain offensive capabilities, and exploiting tactical opportunities when German forces were weakened. Civilian suffering reached acute levels during this period. Prolonged bombardments and ground fighting devastated infrastructure and homes. Displacement and casualties mounted, with many civilians caught between the contending armies facing starvation, disease, and exposure. Humanitarian conditions deteriorated as access to medical care and supplies became increasingly scarce. The intensity of combat exacted a severe psychological toll on soldiers. German and Soviet troops alike endured exhaustion, trauma, and dwindling morale amid the unrelenting violence. Political officers and propaganda efforts on both sides sought to sustain fighting spirit, emphasizing ideological commitment and duty. Despite localized German tactical successes, the Soviet offensives continued to grind forward, eroding German defenses incrementally. The battle's peak underscored the brutal attritional nature of warfare on the Eastern Front, where technological superiority, numerical strength, and tactical skill combined with terrain and weather to produce devastating human costs and strategic stalemates. Ultimately, the peak phase of the Battle of Narva demonstrated the Waffen-SS's capacity to hold critical defensive positions against overwhelming odds, while also highlighting the Red Army's determination and increasing effectiveness. This period shaped the subsequent course of the campaign and had significant implications for control of the Baltic region in 1944. As the Battle of Narva extended into late spring and early summer 1944, both German and Soviet forces faced the harsh realities of sustained combat, prompting tactical adaptations, resource management challenges, and psychological pressures that shaped the course of the conflict. German defenders, primarily composed of Waffen-SS units such as the 20th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, 1st Estonian, and the 11th SS Volunteer Panzer Grenadier Division Nordland, intensified their defensive strategies. Recognizing the increasing Soviet pressure and numerical superiority, German commanders emphasized flexible defense in depth, combining fortified strongpoints with mobile reserves capable of rapid counterattacks. These tactics aimed to disrupt Soviet offensive formations, slow advances, and inflict maximum casualties while conserving their limited resources. The coordination between infantry, artillery, and armored units improved, focusing on exploiting local terrain advantages like forests, riverbanks, and urban rubble. Soviet forces, under commanders such as Marshal Leonid Govorov, adapted by refining their combined arms operations. Recognizing the difficulties posed by German defenses and challenging terrain, they enhanced coordination among infantry, armor, artillery, and air support. Soviet logistics faced strain due to damaged infrastructure and extended supply lines, but the Red Army leveraged its vast industrial capacity and mobilization efforts to maintain offensive pressure. Tactical innovations included the use of artillery bombardments, timed precisely to infantry advances, and increased reliance on engineer units to overcome minefields and fortifications. Partisan activity behind German lines intensified, contributing to the overall pressure on German logistics and communications. Soviet-backed partisan groups targeted railways, bridges, and supply depots, forcing the Wehrmacht to allocate troops to rear-area security, further stretching German defenses. The psychological toll on soldiers was significant on both sides. German troops endured exhaustion, dwindling supplies, and the stress of constant Soviet attacks, while Soviet soldiers faced fierce resistance, harsh weather, and heavy casualties. Political officers and propaganda played critical roles in maintaining morale, emphasizing duty, sacrifice, and ideological resolve. Despite hardships, unit cohesion remained relatively strong, though instances of fatigue and lowered combat effectiveness were reported. Civilian populations continued to suffer amid the ongoing conflict. Prolonged shelling, destruction of homes, and shortages of food and medical care exacerbated civilian hardship. Displacement increased, with many seeking refuge in less contested areas under dire conditions. Both Soviet and German forces imposed strict control over civilians, sometimes resorting to punitive measures against suspected collaborators or resistance supporters. Environmental conditions, transitioning from late spring to early summer, affected operations. Melting snow and spring rains transformed the battlefield into muddy and difficult terrain, impeding vehicle movement and complicating supply efforts. Commanders on both sides had to adjust plans and tactics accordingly. The extended fighting and adaptations during this phase reflected the brutal nature of attritional warfare on the Eastern Front. Both armies displayed resilience and tactical ingenuity, but the human and material costs continued to escalate. This period of resistance and adaptation set the stage for the eventual turning points that would determine control of the Narva region and influence the broader Baltic campaign. The turning point in the Battle of Narva emerged as Soviet forces intensified their efforts to break through the German defensive lines amid the strategic pressures of mid-1944. Despite the formidable resistance of the Waffen-SS units and Wehrmacht formations, the cumulative weight of Soviet manpower, materiel, and tactical adaptation began to shift momentum. A critical moment occurred as the Soviets launched a series of coordinated offensives designed to exploit weaknesses in the German defense, targeting key positions along the Narva River and surrounding areas. These attacks were supported by concentrated artillery barrages, airstrikes, and the use of newly mobilized units. Soviet commanders, including Marshal Leonid Govorov, employed increasingly sophisticated combined arms tactics, integrating infantry, armor, and artillery in concert to penetrate German lines. German forces faced mounting challenges. The prolonged fighting had depleted their reserves and inflicted severe casualties. Supply shortages and logistical difficulties, exacerbated by partisan activity, disrupting rear area communications, further weakened their operational capabilities. Political pressure from the German High Command, coupled with Hitler's insistence on holding ground at all costs, strained commanders who recognized the untenability of their positions. The Soviet advances began to yield tangible results. Key German defensive positions fell after intense fighting, and the Soviet Red Army succeeded in establishing bridgeheads across the Narva River, threatening to envelop German forces. The failure to contain these breakthroughs marked a significant operational setback for the German defenders. Civilian populations bore the brunt of these developments. As the front lines shifted, widespread destruction and displacement occurred. Refugees faced harsh conditions, compounded by the collapse of local infrastructure and the scarcity of food and medical supplies. Both sides' military actions, including punitive reprisals and scorched earth tactics, contributed to the humanitarian crisis. The turning point culminated in the decision by German commanders to begin a strategic withdrawal from the Narva region in July 1944. This retreat, though conducted under pressure and in difficult conditions, aimed to preserve remaining forces and establish new defensive lines further west. The withdrawal marked the end of German attempts to hold the Narva front and signaled a decisive shift in control of the Baltic region. This critical phase underscored the limitations of German defensive capacity in the face of overwhelming Soviet strength and the effective application of combined arms operations. It also highlighted the human cost of protracted warfare, where military decisions had profound consequences for both combatants and civilians. The turning point at Narva thus represented not only a tactical and operational shift, but also a strategic milestone influencing the final phases of the Eastern Front conflict. As the Battle of Narva drew to a close in the summer of 1944, the German forces initiated a systematic withdrawal from the region, marking a significant shift in the Eastern Front's dynamics. This retreat was conducted under mounting Soviet pressure, logistical constraints, and deteriorating strategic circumstances. The withdrawal aimed to preserve combat-effective units and establish new defensive lines further west, notably along the Tannenberg Line, to delay Soviet advances into Estonia and protect the approaches to East Prussia and the Baltic coast. The cessation of active combat operations around Narva followed months of intense fighting, which had resulted in substantial losses on both sides. German units, particularly the Waffen-SS divisions, faced depleted manpower and equipment shortages, forcing a tactical re-evaluation. The Soviet Red Army, emboldened by gains and reinforced by fresh units, maintained relentless pressure, compelling the German command to prioritize the preservation of remaining forces over untenable defensive positions. The immediate consequences of the withdrawal were stark. The Narva region suffered extensive devastation due to prolonged artillery bombardments, urban combat, and scorched earth tactics employed by retreating German forces to deny resources to the advancing Soviets. Infrastructure, including roads, bridges, and communication networks, lay in ruins, impeding civilian recovery and military logistics alike. Civilian populations experienced severe hardships during and after the withdrawal. Displacement increased dramatically as many fled the combat zones or were evacuated under difficult conditions. Food shortages, lack of medical care, and exposure to the elements resulted in heightened mortality and suffering. Both Soviet and German military authorities imposed strict controls over civilians, with reprisals against suspected partisans or collaborators contributing to a climate of fear and repression. The withdrawal and end of the Battle of Narva also precipitated shifts in the wider strategic context. Soviet forces exploited the German retreat to advance further into the Baltic states, ultimately contributing to the isolation of German Army Group North in the Courland pocket. This strategic encirclement would tie down significant German forces until the war's end. Humanitarian crises unfolded amid the devastation, with reconstruction efforts hampered by ongoing military operations and resource scarcity. The scars of the battle persisted in the region's landscape and population for years. In summary, the aftermath and withdrawal phase of the Battle of Narva encapsulated the grim realities of late-war Eastern Front combat. Tactical retreats under pressure, widespread destruction, civilian suffering, and shifting strategic landscapes. The consequences of this phase shaped the course of the Baltic campaign and underscored the profound human and material costs inherent in protracted warfare. The Battle of Narva holds a complex and contested place in the history of the Second World War's Eastern Front, symbolizing both the tactical resilience of the German Waffen-SS and the relentless Soviet drive to reclaim occupied territories. Its legacy encompasses military, political, and cultural dimensions that continue to provoke analysis and debate. Militarily, the battle demonstrated the capacity of Waffen-SS units, especially those composed of local volunteers and conscripts, to mount effective defenses against numerically superior Soviet forces. The fighting around Narva showcased intense combined arms warfare, involving infantry, armor, artillery, and air power, under challenging terrain and harsh weather conditions. Despite ultimately being forced to retreat, the German defenders significantly delayed the Soviet advance, buying critical time for the establishment of new defensive lines and evacuation of personnel and civilians. For the Soviet Union, the eventual victory at Narva was a key step in the Baltic campaign, facilitating the liberation of Estonia and the surrounding Baltic states from Nazi occupation. It exemplified the Red Army's increasing operational maturity, improved coordination, and capacity to sustain prolonged offensives under difficult circumstances. The battle also underscored the high human and material costs paid in the drive to expel Axis forces from Soviet territory. Politically, the battle reflected the complex loyalties and nationalistic sentiments in the Baltic region. The presence of Estonian volunteers fighting within the Waffen-SS, often motivated by anti-Soviet sentiment and fears of reoccupation, added layers of complexity to the conflict. Post-war Soviet narratives largely framed the battle as part of the heroic struggle against fascism, while in the West and among local populations, memories and interpretations have been more nuanced, reflecting the ambiguities of collaboration, resistance, and survival. Culturally, the Battle of Narva remains commemorated primarily within Estonia and Russia, with memorials honoring both Soviet liberators and local defenders. The memory of the battle is intertwined with national identity, historical grievances, and the broader legacy of the war in the Baltics. Scholarly debate continues regarding the battle's significance, the role of Waffen-SS units, and the impact on civilian populations. In historical discourse, the Battle of Narva serves as a case study in defensive warfare, the complexities of multinational military formations, and the strategic interplay on the Eastern Front's northern sector. It highlights the brutal attrition, ideological conflicts, and human tragedies that characterized much of the Second World War. Ultimately, the Battle of Narva stands as a testament to the fierce determination of combatants on both sides and the profound consequences of war for soldiers and civilians alike. Its legacy endures as a poignant chapter in the history of the Eastern Front, reflecting the multifaceted nature of conflict, memory, and national identity in a region deeply scarred by war.